This video is going to go more in depth into the specific procedures at the intake center, starting with setup. The shelter operations manager and the intake team leader are going to arrive at the intake center around 5 p.m. The operations manager is first going to go to the shelter and pick up the property truck, drive it over to intake. The intake center key this year will be found in a lockbox. The operations managers and the intake team leaders will all have the combination to it. Once the key is removed from the lockbox, please remember to reset the combination to all zeros for security reasons. The operations manager and the team leader should first make sure that all the appropriate forms are available, and if any are needed, they can print them right at the intake center. They should find the colored wristbands that will be used for that night. Find the previous night's registration list that will serve as this night's pre-registration list, and then take any other steps needed to get ready for intake operations. In case of inclement weather, pop-up tents should be used. These can be set up right outside the intake center door, and guests should be requested to help set these up. SafeSpace will collect information about each potential guest, including identifying and medical information. Our goal is to make this as minimal and non-intrusive as possible, and we're not going to collect information for other organizations unless the purpose is aligned with our mission. At the same time that we collect the guest information, guests will be asked to agree to the SafeSpace rules as well. Again, these will be read to the guest by a volunteer, and the guest will sign the form, which we'll keep for the season. Guests who have been excluded for any reasons will have to again agree to the rules before being allowed back in. The nightly registration of guests determines who gets in that particular night. So the goals which may conflict include ensuring an orderly process to identify that night's guest, to limit the guests to the predetermined capacity of the shelter, to minimize long waits by guests, to generally admit on a first-come, first-served basis, to decrease the need to wash bedding for guests who will be staying at the shelter on a regular basis. All those things may conflict, but generally it worked well last year, so we're going to try to keep the same process as we did last year. Guests who successfully stayed at the shelter the previous night, again, are automatically pre-registered for that day. And then potential guests who were not on the prior night's registration list will be informed about the likelihood of being able to come in, and then they can be placed on the wait list. Additional spaces may show up because pre-registered guests don't always show up. The shelter operations manager or the intake team leader will keep the wait list. And at this point, any new guests showing up should complete the registration process. Any of the prior night's guests who have not shown up by 6:30 lose their pre-registration priority, and if they do show up then, will go on to the wait list. At 6:30, the intake team leader will determine how many spaces are available, and potential guests who are on the wait list will be entered into the log if there's enough room, and then brought into the property storage process. The registration will begin at 6 p.m. Guests will congregate on the 13th side of the intake center. That's to the downtown side of the church. And guests from the previous night, again, do not have to show up until 6:30. At 6 p.m., the shelter operations manager and intake team leader will start the process, calling the names. Monitors should help to keep the guests from crowding the entrance to the intake center. Names will be called in order from the last night's registration list, then the wait list. Those who are not present when their name is called will have to wait until the list has been called, after which they'll be recalled until about 6:30. As guests are called and as they enter the property storage process, their name will be entered into that evening's guest log. They'll be given a wristband with their sequential number, their first name and last initial, and that will be placed onto their wrist. The property lead should indicate when they're ready for more people, and we're going to try to not have people congregating too much on the stairs or right in front of the door. Once the night's registration list is complete, 2 copies of it should be made. The original should go into the binder labeled guest logs. The first copy goes to the shelter with the guest registration forms, and the second copy will be placed into the intake center binder so it can serve as the pre-registration list for the next night. Once we know which guests are registered, one of the volunteers, either Nightly or Core, whoever's got time, will sort through the individual guest registration forms from the prior night, remove and refile those who are not staying that night, pull the records and add them for current night's guests who didn't stay the previous night, and make sure that we do have these forms for all guests. Property storage. Guests must allow Safe Space to store their personal property. That is a requirement for them to stay. So as they enter the property storage process, they should be greeted, and if they're new, the property rules should be explained to them. The goal, of course, is to prevent contraband from being taken into the shelter, to minimize conflict between guests regarding property, such as space availability and accusation of theft. During the property storage process, all personal property will be bagged other than those items that are specifically allowed into the shelter. The allowed items are shown on a poster right in the property storage area, and any exceptions to this must be approved by the shelter operations manager and must be logged. If you're working property storage, pay attention to items carried in jackets. If necessary, have the guest empty the pockets. Once guest property is placed into a bag, it should be sealed with a wristband with the same sequential number that they have on their wrist already, and the first name, last initial that's found on their wristband. The items that are allowed in should be given to them in a clear plastic bag. And remember that failure to cooperate with property storage is grounds for exclusion. All property must be stored. That's what puts the safe into Safe Space. Following property storage, depending on the weather, guests may elect to wait in the downstairs waiting area or outside until they're called for transportation to the shelter. Guests will be transported from the intake center to the shelter each evening. Evening transportation usually will be done by the work training center, but sometimes the host church, that is, will provide transportation using their own bus. Buses will arrive at intake center around 6:30, and generally the transportation will be in the order that guests are placed on the evening's registration list. So the shelter operations manager or intake team leader will consult with the bus driver regarding the number of guests per trip and figure out the total number of trips. Then we'll call guests up in order of their registration numbers. For example, group 1 will be numbers 1 through 22. Any disabled person should be loaded first for their group. As guests are getting on the bus, 2 monitors should stand near the bus door and confirm, 1, that the guests have the current day's wristband, 2, that they're in the current number range for that trip, and 3, that they're not visibly carrying anything that's not allowed into the shelter, for example, backpacks. Anything they're carrying in should be in the clear plastic bags. Transportation will end whenever the last guest is transported. That will be based on the number of bus trips that we need and the distance to the shelter for round trips. Property transport this year will be a little different. Instead of using cars with volunteers driving the property over, we do have a truck now that is dedicated to property transport. So the shelter operations manager will pick up the property truck prior to 5 o'clock, bring it over to the intake center. It'll be parked on 13th Street. At a convenient time, the intake team leader will organize volunteers, and that can include guests, to move property bags from the downstairs into the property truck. Bags should be placed in the truck in a way that will minimize movement, and a monitor should be placed near the truck during the loading process for security reasons. Once the property storage process is finished, the operations manager will drive the truck back over to the shelter where it will be secured for the night. After guests are transported, the intake team will straighten up the facility. Inside, they'll ensure that all forms and records are filed in the appropriate place, put away the supplies, sweep the floor, including the back room and the kitchen areas, the stairs, the area between the door and the bathrooms. They'll clean the upstairs bathroom and then remove the garbage bag for the day. The outside area should be picked up, and this includes all sides of the church. Guests may congregate on the side in the alley, or they may congregate in the front. And as a courtesy to our hosts who are giving us this facility, let's try to keep it clean for them. The ashtrays from the outside should be emptied, and any trash containers should be emptied into either the downstairs garbage bag or a separate bag as needed. Finally, the intake team leader should turn off all the lights and lock the intake facility. Pull the door to make sure it's properly locked. Lock the key in the lockbox, and again, set the combination to all zeros for security. The next video will look at the intake policies.